Thanks for coming. So considering the interest of this group, I thought I was going to speak about emergence, but we related to agency and boundaries and action perception loops and things like that. So the journey for today, so we have today 1 hour and a half in total, right?
Yeah, we have 1 hour and a half, so you
Good,
can talk
good.
for 1 hour or less.
Yeah, so I have a lot of content, but we will go over it step by step. There is a amount of mathematics, but I will do my best to explain all the math in a very intuitive way. So we will start by some old work of mine on something called causal blankets. That is sort of a different version from the Markov blankets that you might be familiar with. And from there, we will present a way to think about emergence. And then we will use that type of perspective to think about world models. And then at the end, I'm going to sort of summarize some ideas and highlight some things that I'm doing right now. So the first part about blankets, this is done with these people that you might be familiar with, some of them. So the idea is, it started with this old question of what makes an agent an agent. So we think of a naturalized approach to agency. So agents are physical systems, but they have some specific property that not any physical system is an agent. So what makes agents special? And there is this common idea that maybe there is something about their boundaries that makes them special. So an agent is something that acts on the world and is perceiving the world. So you have these input and output channels between the environment and the agent. And these channels are the blanket that is mediating the relationship. And then the sort of intuitive idea is that an agent is defined by their boundaries. And then the question is, how can we characterize the boundaries so that we get a satisfactory notion of agent? So as you might see, be familiar with this literature, there's a lot of papers working on Markov blankets as one candidate construction for the boundaries of agents. And they have been very successful. There's a lot of papers trying to do a bunch of things. There is also a sort of a parallel literature. And the idea of Markov blankets, explained very briefly from my perspective, is that there are two things that you want from such a blanket. You want an asymmetry, so you want the internal memory to trigger actions that affect the environment, that trigger sensations that go here, and you want this asymmetry. You don't want the arrow to go back the other way around. So you want relationships that have a specific directionality. And then at the same time, you want to have statistical mediation, what is known in statistics, conditional independency. So if you condition the states of the boundary, the internal and external are independent. So that's in the right, the other is in the left. And the problem is that the condition in the right doesn't give you the asymmetry, because those things there, they don't have arrows. So you need the two things. You need asymmetry and you want statistical independency, and somehow you want the two things to combine. And from the old literature of the free energy that I haven't followed after 2022, but up to some point, this was the two things that were trying to be combined, and the combination was a bit complicated. It was not trivial. How do you put these two things together? So at that point, we were thinking with some colleagues, how can we get these two conditions, but from a different perspective? Because basically what they were doing, they were putting this Langevin, these equations here, and then the thing was to get the equations such that the stationary distribution satisfied the thing, and then the whole thing worked. But it was a bit complicated. Like you were trying to combine things that are very different. So, and then there were all these critiques for this construction that you might be familiar, papers criticizing different technical aspects of all of this construction. So our idea was a little bit different. The question that we took was the following. You have an experimenter measuring a system. So you have data X and Y, and we will just assume that X is an agent and Y is an environment. That's an assumption. And then the question is, can we derive just from observations what are the blankets? What are the actions that the agent is doing, and what are the observations that the agent is getting from the environment? This is a slightly different question. So we are not looking for where the boundary is. We're assuming that that's the cut that we're interested in. And from that assumption, we want to understand what are the actions and observations. Is it clear? By the way, if you have any technical question at any point, please interrupt me. If you have a long philosophical observation, let's keep that for the end. Okay? That's the policy. So the idea is the following. We the first idea was to build on some idea that is called epsilon machines from computational mechanics. And if you're not familiar with this, the idea is not very complicated. The idea is that you have a time series. Like here is a process with take some numbers, and then for a given history, up to some point, you compute the conditional probabilities for the future. For example, I have seen these numbers, and then I will see these numbers in the future. What is the probability of that? So for any history, you compute those probabilities, those forecasts, and if you have two trajectories that are different, so two histories that are different, but every prediction about the future is the same, you will say, I don't care about that difference. So you put them together. And if you have two histories that has different predictions for the future, you keep them separate. So this is a way to coarse grain histories. You consider all the histories and you group them according to what they predict it will happen in the future. This is the basic idea behind the construction known as epsilon machines. And we are going to take this principle to build the observations and the actions. And how does that work? So we have these two time series, X and Y. We separate them by design. And now we do the following question. We take histories of Y, of the environment, and we consider the future of the agent. So we are not predicting, in the classical case here, you're predicting yourself. You have a single time series, you predict past to future. Here you're doing like in diagonal. So you're predicting from one time series to the other one. And you say, which different histories of the environment give different predictions about the future of the agent? It's clear the idea? And the idea is that this is going to be the observations. So differences in the environment that make a difference for the future internal states of the agent. Because anything of the environment that doesn't make a difference for the agent, we could assume as third-person observers that that is not being perceived because it's not making any difference. So we are keeping the differences in the environment that make a difference for the future of the agent, and we are defining that as the perceptions. This is a coarse graining of states of the environment. And this is what the agent can see. And lo and behold, we can do the construction the other way around. And here what we take is histories of the internal states of the agent, and we coarse grain them according to the ones that give different predictions for the future of the environment. And what is this? Actions. So this is difference in the history of the internal states that make a difference for the environment in the future. And in this way, we are filtering what is in the agent that is not making a difference for the environment. And we say that is not an action, and whatever is making a difference, that is the action. And with this construction that is exactly symmetric, this is a proposition of how you can extract the boundaries from the data. Because usually in the literature, you put the sign of the action perception loop, you know it somehow, and you put it out of nowhere. So here is a way to extract it from data. That's the idea. So the causal blanket is for two time series, is this construction that gives you two coarse grainings, one coarse graining of the history of the environment, another coarse graining of the history of the agent, and that gives you the actions and the observations that are mediating these diagonals. So the sensory is what mediates the past of the environment for the future of the state of the agent, and the action is what mediates the past of the agent with the future of the environment. So this is a mathematical construction. Some properties. The first is that you can always build this. So for any two time series, you can always build this thing, and you will get something. Second is that they are unique. So there is only one for the two time series. And the third is that they have an interesting relationship with this thing called transfer entropy. If you have ever heard of transfer entropy. So whatever transfer entropy you have, for example, from the agent to the environment, you can show that is going through the blanket. So that is accounted by the action. And whatever transfer entropy is going from the environment to the agent is going through the perception. So this is a simple construction, is an idea on how to try to capture these intuitions we have. And there is an interesting property. The following, like we can do statistics and we say, what is the probability? Or now we take the action, the agent environment, the history, the joint history. This is this. And we take for a given history of the agent and the environment, what is the probability of the next state of the agent and the environment together? This is the joint probability. And then here we take the two marginals. So this is the probability of the next state of the agent, given the joint history, and the probability of the next state of the environment, given the two histories. And we're taking here the ratio. So to what degree the next state of the agent and the next state of the environment are entangled in some way. If they are not entangled, those two things should be one, should be the same, and then the logarithm of that should give you a 0. But if they are entangled, you will get something that is larger than 0. And using this quantity that we called here a synergistic coefficient, because it's sort of a notion of entanglement of the two things, you can do a little bit of mathematics, and you can show that the difference here, basically you're seeing how different is my joint process from completely separated two sub-processes. So how much information is going between X and Y, and you can prove that this is equal to what goes through the blankets plus what doesn't go through the blankets. So all of this synergistic coefficient is something that the blankets are not accounting. And I found this interesting because the synergistic part is sort of related with IIT, integrated information theory. It's like the degree of integration between the two parts. And the important part is that this is not being accounted by the blankets. So imagine the blankets are like the border control that is checking what is going in between the two systems. And this synergistic part is going over the two systems in a way that the blankets don't see it. And this is a mathematical truth. So forever, you can always build the blankets, but the blankets will only account for some type of interaction, not for everything. And this could give us a criterion of what is a good blanket. So for any partition X and Y, you can always build the blankets, but maybe this part is very small and this is very large. And that would mean that your blanket is doing a pretty bad job. So the blanket is a bad description of the thing because the system is too integrated. And then the blanket is a bad modeling, it's very poor. But if you have another factorization such that the synergistic part is 0, and every interaction goes through the blankets, that is showing you that that blanket makes sense. So although the blankets can always be built, with this decomposition, you can get an intuition of when they are useful, faithful representations of what is happening and when they are not faithful. And that's what I said here. So what is the summary of this first part? The first is that this is a principal method to build an as-if action perception loop just from data. So you have two streams of data, and you can do some statistics, and you get a candidate blanket. Every time you have two time series, you can get such causal blankets. And one limitation is that they cannot account for this synergy, for this integrated information. And then open questions. The first is, could we use these ideas to try to formalize goals or plans or something like that? Because what we have done is pretty simple, right? Or similarly, can we build some type of inference process from here? Because one interesting thing of the Markov blankets is that according to some people, you can get like Bayesian inference out of the blankets themselves. I don't know if you can get something similar out of this. Would be very interested if it could be possible. I haven't tried too much, so I don't know if it's not possible, but that's an interesting direction for possible investigation. Also, could you use this idea to build like hierarchical agency? And this is something that we will talk more later. And I think the answer is yes. And could we use this in practice with numerical data, et cetera, et cetera? The short answer is not now, because computationally is expensive and we don't have efficient algorithms. You could do it brute force if you have a lot of data, but we need better numerical methods. And that's something that I'm working on, but there is not so much done as I would like. So that is sort of the state of the affairs in this camp. Is it all clear? All good? Any questions at this point? Good. So that's the causal blanket story. Now let's go to hierarchies. So, and this is work with a different crowd. Some people repeat it, as you may notice. So what is the idea here? And this starts from a different motivation, but you will see that there are a number of points in common. The driving question was, what makes a laptop different from a rock? And all of this motivated by this whole discussion. Is the brain a computer? Is the brain computing? What does that mean? Can we get something useful out of that discussion? So the question was, backtracking a little bit, a laptop is a computer. I think everybody agrees, because it's computing something. And a laptop is a physical system. So that means the laptop is following physical laws. Now, a rock rolling down a hill is also a physical system following physical laws. Is the rock a computer? I would not like to say yes. I would like to say no. But the question then is why? Why not? What is the difference between a rock following physical laws and a laptop, a physical laptop following physical laws? And my answer to that question is the following. When you have a laptop, you can program code. You can write a program like that one. You can execute it, and you get a number 5 in your screen, right? And then you can execute it again, and you get the same number 5 in the screen. But the key point is that every time you run this software, the physics that the computer is following might be completely different. But nevertheless, the 5 will always appear in the screen. So there is a low level that is very messy, and every time you run the same algorithm is different. But there is a coarse grain description that is very reliable, and you can direct, you can reprogram, and you can control. You cannot do that with the rock, to my knowledge. There is no way to make code in the rock and coarse grain it and get something that you can steer. So that is, in my opinion, the difference between a laptop and a rock. Now, my claim is that this type of idea, this type of software exists everywhere. For example, in the toilet. How is that the toilet has software? The idea is the following. So whenever you go to the toilet and you flush it, all the water goes out of the toilet. And then the water starts coming back, and there is a floating device that is down. And as soon as the water goes up, it will push the floating device and it will close the water that is coming in. So that is a while loop in programming. So it's a while the water is down, keep putting water in. And as soon as the floating device is being pushed, cut the water in. And every time you flush the toilet, the same algorithm runs in the same way that this Python algorithm here runs to put the number 5 in the screen. However, every time you run it, the fluid dynamics, the Navier-Stokes equations, all of that is different. So there is a lot of this different in the execution of the physics, but there is a coarse grain level where the software runs very reliable every time you flush the toilet. And that is why toilets are useful, because they flush in a predictable way. Right? So the claim here is that every time you have a system with this very strong separation of scales, where the macro is very clear and you can steer it and does something useful for you, that is a computer that is running software. And so basically the idea is that you have a macro where you have macro interventions, macro inputs that completely determine macro outputs, even though the micro things are uncontrollable and they are doing whatever they want. And this happens all the time. Like if you have a self-driving car like this one, the self-driving car has very coarse-grained cameras to see around and is able to navigate without crashing. But the world in which a self-driving car exists is quantum, or maybe super strings or whatever, like super complicated. But the cameras are not capturing that level of detail. It's capturing very coarse-grained information, but it's sufficient for the car not to control quantum effects, but to navigate in the classical world and get to the destination without harming anyone. So I would claim we are the same. Like we live in a quantum world, but our sensors are not quantum. So we live in a very coarse-grained representation of the world that is sufficient for us to survive. So in that sense, and we can control things very clearly. I can grab this and it's very reliable. Even though the quantum effects that are happening, I have no idea what they are happening, but they don't matter for me when I want to drink. So this is a very important, this separation of scales is very important. Now, how can we formalize this idea a bit better? So the idea, we start from a micro-physical process, X, which is running over time. And you know the fluid dynamics of the toilet, very full of detail. And then there is a coarse-grained representation, G, that simplifies X into Z. So now we have the same process running at the coarser level of description at the macro level. So we have these two levels. And the first definition we're going to put is to say a coarse graining is informationally close if, so here we do the following. We try to predict the future of the coarse grain representation, like what is the number that will come in the screen after I run the code. And we will do the prediction in terms of the past states of the coarse grain level, so the algorithm, not the physics, by the algorithm. And we're going to compare this prediction. So this is a mutual information. So it tells me how much information in the past of the macro is about the future of the macro. And we are going to compare this with how much information in the past of the micro, so the microphysics, I can get about the future of the macro. So basically, you're doing the same prediction. You're trying to predict the future of the macro, but either from this level or from that level. And in this idealized information theory world, information never hurts. It's always good to have more information. So this is usually going to be larger than this. This is always equal or larger. But if they're equal, that means that there is no useful information in X that is not in set. So all the useful information to predict set is in set itself. So in that sense, it's self-contained informationally. So all the information that is useful for itself is in itself. And that is information closure. Now, a slightly different question is about causal closure. So what are the differences that make a difference? And are those differences at the macro level or at the micro level? And how can we reason about this? And here will come an idea that is very, very similar to the causal blanket story. We go back again to the epsilon machine story that I showed before. So the same idea, you have these trajectories and you merge them if they have the same prediction ability and you keep them separate if not. The one interesting thing about epsilon machines is that they give you a latent, a dynamical representation of your data. So they give you this HMM type of construction, a hidden Markov model, where the dynamics in the latent space are supposed to represent what's happening behind the scenes, and they're emitting the data that you observe. And what we're going to do here is something that we call an upsilon machine. And the idea here is that you have the past of the micro and the future of the macro, and this is the epsilon machine of the micro. You can have the coarse grain data, so you have the past of the macro, the future of the macro, the epsilon machine of the macro. So this and these are epsilon machines at two scales. And now we do this construction that is like this. So what we're doing here is that we're coarse graining states of the environment, of the micro, to the degree they give the same predictions about the future of the macro. So it's the same construction from the causal blankets, but instead of doing it between processes, we are doing it between scales, from micro to macro. And we are coarse graining states of the micro that give the same control for future macro. And the idea is that when we coarse grain like that, we are just keeping the differences that make a difference. And then an interesting question comes comparing these two things. So these are the distinctions of the micro that make a difference for the macro, and these are the distinctions of the macro that make a difference for the macro. And if they are the same, that means that every distinction that you could want to do in order to control your macro process, you could make it at the macro level. And that we call causal closure. That means every knob that could be useful to grab is a macro knob. You don't need to have very thin fingers to prepare your system in a very quantum state to have some outcome that you want. Every outcome that you could want, you can prepare it from a coarse grain level. So the first notion, information closure, is about prediction. This is about preparing the system in a condition and letting it run and see what happens. Good. And then we have another idea to put into the pudding. So we have information closure, we have causal closure, and now we have a notion of computation. And what we'll do is the following. So the epsilon machine, as I said before, you have this data and you can infer these latent dynamics that represent the data. What is interesting is that the way of building epsilon machines have this dual representation as machines. A machine here is a very simple idea. A machine is something that has a state, and every time you put an input, update the state to another state. And because how we build this dynamical model, it can be represented as a computational model. And here, the idea is that you have a state, you observe some new data, and that acts as an input, and then you update the state, and then you observe another data, and you update your state, and then you have you move around between states depending on what inputs you're putting into your machine. Now, what is interesting is that if you have
clarification. So the difference between this computational and dynamical description is just because still dynamical description also some state is changed, no?
Yes.
What is actual difference?
Yeah, it's a very subtle difference. So if you have a general model like this, you couldn't represent it like this.
Oh.
But because of how epsilon machines are built, they have a special property that allows you to represent it like this. And so these are equivalent descriptions. These are the same model, but it's sort of seen in a different way. And the distinction is that in here, I mean, in reality, you have the two things, but here you're sort of, this is the way I think of it. Here you're playing the game to think this is really happening, and this is emitting this data. And here you flip it, and here you say, the data that I'm observing is not a consequence of the hidden state, but is something I'm putting out of my pocket into the machine, and is triggering the dynamics of this thing. So you're sort of flipping the arrow of consequences. But in reality, this is a model, and you're choosing to interpret it in one direction or in the other direction.
I see, I got it.
That's something that is confusing a little bit from the literature. So you cannot make a causal claim in terms of the relation between the blue and the yellow, because the only thing that is real is the blue. The yellow is something you are imagining.
Yeah.
But you are choosing to interpret it in one way or another, and then you can use, like here, you can use statistical or dynamical notions to interpret it, and here you can use computational ideas to interpret it. Good. Okay, so we have this duality, and now we can play with it. So the way we will play with it is that we are going to have the data. This is the data that you're measuring. We will have it at different levels of resolution, and then we can build these machines at different levels of resolution. And one way to think of these machines, I like thinking of them as the theory that explains the data. And so the machine is some sort of mechanism that is moving around and generating your data. And an interesting question is, how are these machines related to each other? And to my surprise, when I first started thinking about this, I thought that they would be related in some simple way, but they are not, usually not. Sometimes you coarse grain your data and your machine becomes super complicated. It all depends on the coarse graining. So some coarse grainings will make your machine more complicated, and some coarse graining will make your machine simple. So one way to think what is a good coarse graining is a coarse graining that simplifies your machine or your theory. You're leaving out certain details so that the theory that explains what remains is simpler than before. And based on that idea, we came with the idea of computational closure. And the idea here is the following. You have these machines. So machines have these little states. And every time you have an input, so here the original input can be of three types, A, B, and C. So from each state, you have three arrows coming out of it. So here you have one arrow that maybe is A, and then you have a B, and you go here. So in this machine, you have dynamics between these little things. So the question is, can you now make like a bigger state? So now you have a big state that corresponds to this 4, this state that corresponds to this 4, and this state that corresponds to this 4. And can you build like bigger arrows that correspond now to two types of arrows? So these big states only have two arrows coming out. Can you make a machine like that that is a simplification of the older machine? In general, it's not possible, but sometimes maybe it's possible. And when you have these nested machines, that's sort of an interesting idea. So what we define is we say a coarse graining, an F that gives you a set, a simple representation, is computationally closed if the epsilon machine that corresponds to the coarse graining has this property that, like, if you have here and you build the epsilon machine, or if you coarse grain and you build the epsilon machine, there is a way to coarse grain the epsilon machine to get here. So I like thinking of this relationship the way quantum mechanics relate with classical physics. So you have quantum data, you coarse grain your data, you have classical data, and you build classical physics. Now you have quantum mechanical data, you build quantum mechanics as a theory, and then there is a way to simplify your theory to get classical mechanics. So the two theories are compatible, and one is a simplification of the other. So this is what we are requesting here. We are saying the computational models that generate your data are compatible so that there is a way to simplify this model to get this. This in general is not possible. If you try a random coarse graining, this epsilon machine will be bigger than this, and then there is no way to simplify this to get this. But if your coarse graining is good, you will have this relationship that if you go like this or like this, you end up in the same place. So this diagram commutes. Good. So this is the idea of computational closure. This notion is a bit more difficult to grasp, but I will show you some examples in a bit that I hope will clarify a bit what is the meaning of this. So what are so far I have just defined things. And in mathematics, defining is cheap. You define whatever you want. But what are the consequences of these definitions? The main consequence is that these notions are all very tightly related. Information closure is equivalent to causal closure under the assumption that there is no late hidden forces. Like you're observing the whole system. This is a bit starting from a physical perspective, like physics. So you say, the micro that I'm conceiving contains everything that has to be considered. So it's like a closed system in physics. And then under that assumption, information closure, so optimal prediction and optimal control are equivalent. But the important relationship is the second one. This either information or causal closure implies computational closure. So the information closure or causal closure is stronger. Whenever you have information closure, you have computational closure. And whenever you have computational closure, you don't always have the other one. So from these ideas, this is sort of the master plan. So how do you use this? This is how you use it. Imagine you have some data, you're measuring some process of interest, and your process can take 5 values, like A, B, C, D, E, or 0, 1, 2, 4, or 5. This is represented as here, this. So this is a coarse graining that lets you see all the distinctions. And now you have a process that is taking some values and you are studying it. So here we have a diagram with all possible coarse grainings of your data. So the way to read this is whenever you have this, you are confusing this with this, or you're confusing this with this, or this with this. So here you're confusing 2, and then you stay with 4 different values. Here you confuse 3, you stay with 2. Here you confuse, you keep 3, you keep 2, or you keep 1. So as you go up, you keep less and less details. Now, those are all possible coarse grainings. And I was saying before, this tells you an idea what is a good coarse graining. So only some of them will be good for your process. And here you keep the good ones. So this is a map of all the levels of description of your data that is causally close. So it's good at the data level. And this gives you the different levels of reality that are self-contained. But maybe there are too many, and maybe some of them are computationally equivalent. So what you do then is that for every of these levels, you compute their epsilon machine, this type of description, and you can map them. And because this implies this, you know that every state of this is going to be a coarse graining of this. So now in the rightmost part, you have a coarse graining of machines. And whenever you have processes that have different machines, they are computing something different. To give an example, imagine that you have some process and you keep 2 states, and these 2 states are IID. They're like jumping between themselves and they're completely random. So they're not computing anything, it's just random. But they look different, right? They look different from, this is one that is like 0, 0, 0, like you get nothing. But if this is IID and you compute the machine, you're going to get this one state that goes to itself and it's not doing anything. So although these coarse grainings look different, in a computational representation, they're the same. So in the right, you are keeping the levels that are actually doing something different. They are not just they don't just look different, they actually are different. So this is the power that gives you going all the way to the right. So it's a bit more work, but there you see the whole thing. And my view is that the picture in the right is showing you the computations that are happening in the system, but in a hierarchical way. So you can see this is all the computations that are happening, and then you can factor them in 2 components, and then you can simplify them again and go up. Let me give you an example. This is an example. Here we have a network. a graph with a lot of edges, and we have strongly connected clusters and weakly connected between clusters. So it is a very modular network, okay? And we're going to have a random walk over this graph. So we start in some random node, and then we are going to switch to another node with probability proportional to the strength of the links. So that means with high probability, we will stay in the same community. So maybe we start here, and then we will be wandering between this graph for a while, and eventually we will switch to here, and then we will stay here for a while, and then eventually we will switch here, and like that. So this is our process that we're studying for some reason. Okay, so we collect data, we model the thing, we realize that has this property, etc., etc. And importantly, the edges, all of these edges between are all the same weight, and all the edges within have the same weight. So it's very symmetric. So what this theory shows you is that now you can re-represent your process by keeping track only in which community you are. So for example, we start in community A and we stay here for very long, and eventually we switch to the blue and we stay here, and then we switch to the green and stay here. So here we have a new random walk that is simpler than this. And you can prove in this specific model that this is informationally closed, computationally closed, and causally closed, everything closed. And then there is a further simplification that you could choose to do. Here we keep which size of community you are. So are you in this one or in this one? But you don't know in which. Or you are in a size 9, so either in this of the three. So this is even a simpler description. Here you have random walk, you start here, eventually you switch, eventually you switch. So super simple description. And this is also, you can calculate that this is computationally closed. What is the consequence of this? There are two important consequences. The first, let's say you want to model your system. You want to model in your computer to see what it does. If what you care is about communities, you can do a perfect simulation without modeling all of this, because these scales are separated. So all the information that is relevant for this stays here. So you can do a perfect simulation without these details. These details don't add anything to what is happening here. Or if what you care is at this level, you can simulate this and forget about all of that, and you're not going to make any approximation errors because you're not modeling everything. So whenever you identify these levels that are close, you can forget about the things below if you don't care about them. That's one consequence. Another consequence, let's say you are starting here and you have to decide what to do next. So you could split the computation into steps. So first you say, okay, I will first choose what is the size of my next community. Maybe I will go to a community of size 9. And then you can decide between the three to which one I want to go. Oh, I want to go to the blue. And then you say within the blue, I want to go to this guy. So basically you are splitting the computation in 3 steps. You're first doing the macro computation, then the meso computation, then the micro computation. So you can factor those computations and doing one by one instead of doing the whole thing in one shot. And also, if you want to stop at some point, you can stop. So you could do this and stop there and then keep running. So this also allows you to run your algorithm at whatever resolution you want. So this is what is useful. Basically, the intuition here, you have a computation that is very complicated. You can split it at levels of resolution, and this tells you at what levels you can choose to stop. Okay, let's go from a bit more relevant examples. This is an example from thermodynamics, a classic example of diffusion. So here you have 2 chambers with gas. Let's say you start all the gas here, particles, and then with low probability, you switch randomly to the other one. And then you stay here, and with low probability, you switch here. So why this is interesting? Because you can start with all the particles in this one and 0 here, and eventually, like here, everything is up, and very quickly you thermalize, and then you end up basically 50-50 with some fluctuations. So this is a classic model of diffusion, like the second law of thermodynamics. So one thing you can prove is that in this model, the number of particles, so if you want to know the full state of the system, is a vector, this vector with zeros and ones, that is 0 if the first particle is here, 1 if it's here. So this is a very big vector. If you have 100 particles, you have 100 numbers, and you have 2 to the 100 states. So there's a lot of possibilities. But the macro description is how many particles there are here and how many particles there are here. And you can prove that this level of description is computationally close. So you can simulate your process at this level with this Markov chain. So you're here with some probability you go up, with some probability you go down. You can do perfect simulations without considering the details. And that's the secret of thermodynamics. In thermodynamics, you can do a perfect modeling of a glass of water by checking volume and pressure and temperature and forgetting the details. But this is showing that this theory is compatible with the intuition we have from thermodynamics. Another example, have you heard of Hopfield networks, I presume? So in Hopfield networks, what we have is an initial condition, some random zeros and ones in some neural network. And then we have patterns that the system is remembering. And based on similarity, the system will retrieve one of the patterns. So here, for example, is sort of closer to this number 2. So most likely it will correct these errors and will retrieve a number 2. So what you can do is that for every pattern, you can compute the dot product, like the similarity between the current pattern and every particular target. This is like the similarity. If this number is 1, they are the same. If this number is 0, they are very, very different. And you can prove that if you compute, for example, here these 5 numbers, I'm doing it here with more than 5, you start and all of them are a bit different, and eventually one of them will take off and will get very close to 1. And this is the pattern that was retrieved. And all the others will stay slow. So the claim is that what is actually happening here is just captured by this similarity coefficient. You can forget if there are 2 patterns that are different, but all their coefficients are the same, that difference will make no difference at all on the long-term retrieval. The retrieval is dominated only by this similarity coefficient. So if you only want to predict what will be retrieved, you can keep the macro description, you can forget about the neurons, and you get a much simpler description of what is going on. So this is another example. Here you are, with this approach, you are keeping only the details that make a difference for the system, and you can forget about details that are irrelevant. Let me skip that. One thing that I'm doing at the moment, this is work in progress, we are doing the following. We have some data, we generate data from this process, and we train a transformer, like a little LLM, to predict this data. And what happens is quite interesting. If you have a transformer that is large enough, so you have enough dimensions, you can predict at all the levels, in meso, micro, macro, everything. You train here, and your prediction gets very good. But if the transformer is not big enough, that is such that it is not big enough to learn the microdata, it can still learn the coarse-grained representations. So if this holds, for my example, this is only one example, this is a work in progress, I'm studying other scenarios. If this holds, it could be that these abstractions are actually abstractions that systems naturally find when they cannot fit the whole thing. So if you don't have capacity to memorize every detail, you naturally switch to a coarser level, which you can keep track of. So maybe these are natural abstractions that systems find in order to keep track of what is going on. Because here the transformer has no idea about any of these levels, anything. It's just trying to predict. And is spontaneously finding these coarse grainings. So, as a summary, yes?
Because of the transformer structure, I mean, if I use the real network to become a function,
Yeah.
then usually the coarse graining happens in the learning, I think.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
We should investigate. I expect maybe it's not depending on the architecture, but yeah, that's a question that should be empirically evaluated. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the summary of this part. So this is one notion of emergence. We are here thinking about emergence as closure of scales that are autonomous, either computationally or informationally or causally. The idea here of computational closure means levels that are controllable in an efficient way. So you can control that level, forgetting what is happening below. And there is a preliminary evidence that transformers are naturally finding these computational closed levels. And I'm anticipating, forget about this. This is what we'll see next. But the sort of the general claim is that these are the levels at which you can control things. And then this is useful for agency, right? Because if you're an agent with limited resources, you cannot control everything. Maybe you naturally choose to control at one of these levels where you cannot control everything, but then you can control that if you restrict yourself to that. So that's the idea for that. And now let's use some of these ideas to think about word mods. Any questions at this point? Other questions? Yes.
When I think about the mind processing, I want to apply this to the neurons and the mind process. The neurons are, of course, the micro level dynamics, and the mind is the macro level.
Yes.
And then usually, the psychology is not good enough because I don't know, but the coarse graining, the way of coarse graining is not good enough.
Yeah.
But the problem is that it's quite difficult to discriminate the micro and macro layer completely.
Yes.
Sometimes it's just affect, I don't know how, but they interact with each other, and then we cannot predict. So that macro level is not enough to explain that behavior at the macro level. But what you are saying that we are always discriminate the micro and macro completely, or you're just explaining that the macro layer can emerge? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So basically, what I'm saying with this is that here the only thing that is real is this. Something is happening. But so all of these are possibilities for the system that if the system could want to control at this level, it can forget about this. And then what the system is actually doing is another question. So I think this is something I haven't done, but I've been thinking about. Like maybe you can, if a system is controlling itself, you can try to choose to check at what level is controlling itself. And I would expect that not every system is controlling themselves at the micro level. So my conjecture is that one efficient choice to self-control is to control yourself at one of these levels. So that might be a reasonable choice. But yeah, again, the interesting thing is that this is an empirical question that can be evaluated in concrete cases. And another point of interest is that I would expect, first, empirically, I would never expect perfect separation, as you say. So I would always expect a little bit of leakage. This theory is sort of the first step in this direction, so it's just perfect separation. And we need tools to do not perfect separation. We don't have those tools yet, but I'm hoping to start developing them soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And the second point is that I would expect maybe a healthy mind, it's almost separated, but maybe some conditions may break the separation. Like I like this metaphor that when you're using a computer and the computer is fine, you just use it at the macro level. But when something goes wrong, you have to go down into the BIOS. And when something is very wrong, you have to open it up and start soldering. So different conditions require interventions at different levels. So I would expect the separation to be affected by problems. So that's another point. Yes?
Yes, just following up on that. So when this model can apply to mind and the brain, that sounds a bit like the classical cognitive psychologists who say that, okay, so we can just look at behavior and then do some experiments and we can forget about brains. And so does that justify that kind of claim?
Yeah, no, I agree. So it's very funny because I am personally very on board with embodied cognition and all of that. And I'm sort of doing exactly the opposite here. But in all fairness, like my interest is to see how far this can go. I would expect it to fail, and I would like to understand why or how it fails. So my feeling is that this is going to capture some aspect of the mind. I will, with what I present later, I hope is clear that I think this is capturing some notion of abstractions that we might be making cognitively, but I would definitely not expect this to explain everything. And my interest would be to say, okay, what can we explain with this? What cannot explain? What do we need to complement and understand more? Yeah. So let's go to this part that is going to be a more juicy one. And this is going exactly in this direction. So this is work with other people, Manuel Valteri, that you might know, and Alex Boyd. So the idea here is the following. Imagine that a friend of yours, a colleague of yours, gives you a robot that you have no idea how it was built. So it's just given after it's built. So the only thing you know is that you know the actions that the robot can do in the world, and you know the sensory that can go into the robot. And your task is to build a sandbox for the robots. You want to build a virtual environment where this robot can be tested before deploying it. Because, if you put in the world a robot that you don't know what will do, it's a bit dangerous. So you would like to build a simulated environment so that you can test the robot in different ways, so to check if it's trustable, if it's safe, etc., etc. And let's say, for the sake of the argument, that you know how a faithful world will look like. In practice, this is very hard, but let's say we know. And that means that you know exactly the statistics of when the robot does something, what are the probabilities of the next sensory information. So you have some ground truth about how the world of the agent should look like. My claim is that even if you know that, the thing is not finished, because maybe you have a world model that works and does the job, but maybe it's too detailed, it's too complicated. Maybe your plan is to do a simulation of the whole planet. And maybe your robot is like a little insect. So you don't need to do so much a big world. So maybe you can compress it. Or maybe the agent only sees some degree of resolution, like can only see classical physics, cannot see quantum. So you shouldn't simulate quantum for that robot. And maybe the agent is in a corner of the world, so it's only interacting with some parts. So the intuition here is that we would like to make a simulation, but also we would like to make an efficient simulation. We would not like to simulate more than what we need. And that's the intuition from before. We would like to simulate at a computationally close level. We don't want to throw resources out for no reason. So the inspiration comes from this old thought experiment that I expect all of you are very familiar. So the idea here in the brain in a vat is that we have a brain and we connect some electrodes to the motor cortex. So we read when the brain is sending instructions, and then we send sensory that is compatible with what the brain would see. And the thought experiment goes that if we do this simulation properly, the brain will not be able to tell the difference. Of course, I disagree with all of this, but let's go for it for the sake of the argument, that something like this could be done. I don't think this can be done for real brains, but I think this could be done for artificial systems. Right? So let's say we have an RL robot with a very restricted scope of vision and very restricted scope of actions. Maybe for that system, you can build such a simulation. And then if you can do a good simulation, then you could test your robot in a very safety way. So why I think this question is interesting for the case of AI systems. I don't think personally this is a very interesting question for humans, but for robots, there are two things that you could achieve. First is you can answer the question, how can we make this world model as efficient as possible? And that becomes useful because you can test safety concerns. And so this is sort of a practical outcome, and also more theoretical. By being able to build this minimal world for the agent, you could learn what the agent can actually see. Right? Because if you make a world that is as small as possible and the agent can still not see the difference, so it thinks it's the actual world, whatever you're simulating is what the agent is interacting with. And by having that, you will be able to see, the agent cannot notice smell, for example, but can see light or something. So you can circumvent the scope of what is accessible to the agent through that lens. And that is interesting because you understand the capabilities of your robot. So these are the motivations. One is a practical motivation. If we can do this, it will be efficient, so we can test very many things very quickly. And the other one is that if we can do this, we can also learn a lot about the robot, like how the robot perceives the world, like the umwelt of the robot. So how do we do this? We start with a little bit of math. So we are going to define the interface of the robot. This is the idea how the robot sees the world from inside the robot. And this is just some probabilities. So Y here is going to be the inputs, and A is the actions. So the interface is just some probabilities. Here the notation is, whenever you see this, is like from 0 to t, and when you see only 2 points, it's like from 0 to infinity. So the probability is, what is the probabilities of seeing a sequence of observations when the robot has done a specific sequence of actions? So let's say the robot can kick something or can walk away, and you say, I assume the robot has done this sequence of actions. What are the probabilities that with these actions, the robot will actually receive this type of inputs? And there's a collection of probabilities for everything that could happen. And the claim is that these probabilities characterize the world of the robot. Because even though there might be a world out there, the robot cannot directly interact with the world. It's only interacting with choosing actions and then receiving the consequence of the actions. And all of that is contained in these probabilities. So this is the starting point. We start with the interface of the robot. Of course, this is very hard to have, but this is a bit of a thought experiment. We say, okay, let's assume that we have this. And the question is, for a given interface of a robot, for a given perspective, how can we put a word model that explains that interface? And as a probabilistic graphical model, an interface looks like this. So you have a big string of actions, and this generates a big string of observations. And from a computer science perspective, this is a horrible idea. You cannot simulate this because as the actions start growing and the observations start growing, you have an exponential lookup table. So this doesn't scale. You cannot program this in a very scalable way. And my claim is that world models is what makes this simulation possible. So we define something we call transducer as a third process. So the only real processes here are the red and the green, the actions and the observations. And now we are going to imagine S, the blue ones. This is a complete imputation. I take it out of my pocket. I say, okay, I believe on this blue thing. And the only requirement that we ask for a transducer is that when we put it in the table, in the probability, this thing gets factorized. So the way it works, you flip your coin to have the initial state of your transducer, and then condition on this, given this, you can generate this. And then you generate the new state, condition on this too, and this. And then given this, only based on this, you generate this. So the point is that the blue thing is sort of keeping track of the information that is relevant. It serves as a sufficient statistic. And by believing on the existence of the blue thing that you invented, you can then simulate the thing and keep running it forever in a very efficient way. So what is important is that to generate the next observation, you only need this kernel that is very small. And as t goes to infinity, the size of the kernel is the same. And this is sort of a conceptual point. This is a very general idea of what a word model is. This is a word model, and anything that satisfies this condition is a word model. A word model is a variable that the agent believes on that allows to do this type of simulation, or not even the agent, like the simulator of the world of the agent. This is an external, it's like the architect in the Matrix. If you saw the Matrix, the movie, this is the architect that is creating the Matrix for the agent. So there is a variable that the architect is bringing out of nowhere, but it's allowing to do this computation in a scalable way. The first observation, anticipating a little bit, for a given interface, there are many worlds that are potentially compatible. In the same way that as a human being, I can believe in many religions or worldviews or things like that. And many of them will explain what I see as a consequence of my actions. And an interesting question is, how can you choose a good world model? Because there are many for any interface. And another interesting point is that the world model do not depend on how smart is the agent or how is this a transformer or a deep reinforcement learning or anything. It just depends on the interface. Yeah, let me skip this. If you're familiar with reinforcement learning, this transducer idea is actually, if you have heard of partially observed Markov decision processes, POMDPs, this is one type of transducer. When you have so in POMDPs, depending how you index the things, you get either this or this. And if you compare this with this, the only thing is that you're cutting some arrows. And the idea here is that in POMDPs, you are assuming that the blue is a physical process, is a real world. And that assumption implies that whatever you observe from the world shouldn't affect the world. It's like, this is not quantum. It's not that I'm observing this, and by observing it, I'm affecting it. This is a classical modeling. So here, for example, this is the state of the world. I observe this, and this do not affect the next state of the world. The next state of the world is affected by the previous state of the world and my action, but not by my observation. So POMDPs are, this is more general. You allow more things. And if you cut the arrow that goes from the red to the blue, you get these two types of world models that are POMDPs. This is different. Here, the observation affects the next state of the world. And you could say, why would I want that? Well, maybe this thing is not a physical world, it's a state of knowledge. Maybe this is what the agent knows to that point. And then this model makes sense because you're saying, this is my state of knowledge that is keeping everything that I should keep in mind. And I see something new, so I want to integrate it to my state of knowledge to get a new state of knowledge, right? So what is useful about this transducer is that you're unifying all of these things. So if you're familiar with reinforcement learning, in reinforcement learning, you have POMDPs, and then there is a standard construction to do something called belief MDP. That is, you're using the beliefs on the hidden state as states of an MDP. And then you get something like this. So basically, the transducer is a very general architecture that models everything. And depending on things that you want to cut, because you're modeling different things, you can choose and specify it. But this gives a more general construction. That's what we are focusing on transducers. So, first question. For a given interface, can I always find a transducer that serves as a word model? And the answer is yes, but in a very boring way. You can say, well, I can imagine a variable S that is everything that have ever happened before. We call it Funes from Borges. I don't know if you have read Borges. There is this character that remembers everything, that he cannot forget anything. So here the world remembers everything, and mathematically that works. That is not a very satisfying answer because it means that the size of the blue thing grows with time, and that is exactly what we don't want. We would like the number of states to keep the same. So this is a bit cheating, but mathematically it works. So with this, we can say, okay, there is a transducer that always works. Then the next question is, can we reduce it? Because here, that's definitely an overkill. We should do better than this. But this is a starting point. We can start from here. So in principle, it requires exponential amount of memory. So can we compress this word? And then comes the notion of word reduction. For a given word model, how can we reduce it? And the idea here is that we take a coarse graining. So we start from this word model, and now we have a function that merges some states of this blue world to get this simplified world. And the claim is, if the simplified world still has the statistical properties that separates like this, that's a valid reduction. Not any coarse graining is a word reduction because many of them will break this factorization property, but some of them will work, and those are word reductions. If you're familiar with RL, these are called bisimulations in the RL literature. So with this notion of word reduction, we can define isomorphic words. That means words that are the same but have different names. They are labeled in different ways. And an isomorphic world, you start with one and you can reduce it to another, and this one you can reduce it back to this. So they are equivalent, basically. So by relabeling, you can go between each of them. So they look the same, different, but they are the same. And also by using this idea of reduction, we can do this game that we start in some world, we can reduce it and reduce it and reduce it up to a point that here you only reduce it to something that you can come back. So if every reduction of yourself is isomorphic to yourself, you cannot reduce yourself to something that is not yourself, then you're minimal. You cannot reduce anymore. You can just change the names, but you cannot keep compressing. So we are interested in these minimal worlds. And an interesting question is, let me put the question first. Do you think, let's say I'm a robot, I have my interface, and I can start from different worlds. And I start from two possible worlds, two beliefs on some world, and I compress each of them separately. So the question is, do you think I will arrive to the same point if I reduce enough? And I originally thought yes, because that should be the minimal world. But long story short, the answer is no. So you can have interfaces such that if you start from different initial conditions and you start reducing, you get these minimal worlds that are not related to each other, which is very annoying. It's weird, like why we cannot keep reducing? But it's just the mathematics are like that. So at this point, you have two choices. One is to accept that life is like this, and we have to embrace that there are minimal worlds that are incomparable, and that's life. Or we can take the blue pill, or the red pill, I don't remember which one, but the crazy pill, and we accept that there are some probabilities that are negatives and make sense, which is also weird. But let me try to convince you that makes sense. What is a general, a quasi-probability? Imagine you have a coin, a weird coin with 3 states, with those probabilities. That makes no sense, right? What the hell is that? Now, my claim is that if from these 3 states you confuse these two, so now you have only 2 states, this or these two, you are going to get a fair coin, right? But now if you choose to confuse this and these two, you get an unfair coin. So basically, this is a reality that you cannot observe directly, but you can observe in a simpler way, in different ways, and it's going to look different depending on how you coarse grain. So I think of it a little bit like a quantum thing, something that cannot be observed directly, but can be observed from different perspectives, and it gives you different things depending on how you observe it. And you can say this is nonsense, and you can throw it away, but why not? So if you accept this type of probability, the important thing is that this thing still sums up to 1. If it doesn't sum up to 1, then it doesn't work. This sum up to 1, but can have some negative terms here and there. So if you accept this, then you can say, well, basically what happens is that to find the minimal world, you have some equation, and you have to do some minimization, and you say, no, but I want probability, so I want my numbers to be always larger than 0. Never negative. And what happens is that if you have a minimization with less constraints, you have better solutions. It's not magic. So there is a theorem that says if you accept negative transitions, there is always one minimal world. But we'll have negative transitions. So this is what I think. So if you accept this negative transition, there is a minimal world always, but it might be not observable. So a bit playing with things, I like thinking that maybe this is a mathematical explanation of the Kantian notion of noumena, that the reality as it is, we cannot observe it, but it's there, and we can observe it from different places, and it will be different. But what is interesting, this is just mathematics, that's the way it is. So if you have an interface, a robot, and you want to find the minimal world to simulate the robot, it's usually going to have negative transitions. What does it mean? It means that if you want to run the world in a computer, and you want to generate observations for your robot, you can do it, and this is the most efficient way to do it. However, you're not going to be able to reason about what the hell that world is doing. It's going to be a black box. You will run it. It will get the right observations to the robot. You have no idea what is going on. If you want to do something more interpretable, you have to run a world that is a statistical process, good old-fashioned statistics with not negative numbers, but that's going to be less efficient. So this is saying that there is an intrinsic trade-off between efficiency and interpretability. If you want to be interpretable, it's not the most efficient. If you want to be efficient, it's not the most interpretable. Good. So that's one direction. Now, if we go for interpretability, what can we do? We know now that if we go full to compression efficiency, we're going to get this quantum black box that we can reason about, although it's very efficient and it's unique. If we want to be interpretable, we can make choices. We can say, I don't want to consider any transducer. I want transducers that the agent could be thinking about, that could be computed by the agent in real time. And these are different definitions. You can say a world is predictive if it doesn't have future information. If the state of the world has information about the future, that is not accessible for the agent that is experiencing that world. So that's out. So it has to be predictive. And observable means that there is some way to take the experience of the agent and make a function and estimate the state of the world. So these are the type of worlds that we would like. Some world that the agent could compute in real time. And yeah, and don't worry about the infiller. And another idea, something that with Manuel we call playfully bellification, is a process that you start with a physical world and now you turn into beliefs. So now the states of the world, as I said before, is this beliefs of the agent, maybe Bayesian beliefs, and then you have an observation and then you do Bayesian updating to have the new world. And the interesting thing, if you use beliefs as states of the world, those are things that the agent can be computing in real time. So the idea, we want now to think of worlds that the agent could be computing so that we understand how the agent is thinking. And actually, we prove in the paper that Bayesian belief updating is a word model in this sense. So it has this property that factorized things and everything works. So this is one choice. Like you believe in a world, you build the Bayesian posterior based condition on the past actions and observations. It gives some distributions. Now the distributions are the states. These ones are distributions, like random distributions. And those are formally states of a world, which is an epistemic world. It's a world that contains how much the agent knows. Now, there is a notion of epsilon machine for this scenario. And the way it works is very similar to the things we saw before. It's a bit more complicated because there are more terms, but it's the same idea. Here we say we want, so H here is A, comma, Y. So the joint history of observations and actions. And you're basically doing the same idea that you consider histories, and if give the same probabilities for the next observations, you put them together. And you make a coarse graining that is, and will merge all the histories of actions and observations that give me the same prediction for the next observation. It just looks more complicated because you have actions, observations, conditions, etc. But it's the same idea. You're merging histories if they give the same probability. And this gives you something that is called epsilon transducer instead of the epsilon machine. And the epsilon transducer has a number of interesting properties. The first is, you remember that we had this Funes transducer, the thing that memorized everything? And remember we have this idea of bisimulation, that is merging states that are equivalent? The epsilon transducer is the minimal bisimulation of Funes. So you start from Funes and you start going down, down, down by simplifying, 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 until you cannot simplify anymore, you get this. As I showed, if you start from another point, you might not get to the same point. But if you start from Funes, this is the deeper you can go. The other important point is this, and the point is the following. Let's say you have two robots with different interface, with the same interface, like the two robots are sort of the same robot. But let's say one believes in some weird religion, super metaphysics, blah, 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 and there's another robot that believes in a different religion. So they have different metaphysics, they believe in different worlds, but they both explain the same interface. So what they perceive and how they act is the same, but they just embrace different worlds because of, I don't know why. So if you build the Bayesian beliefs on these two worlds are going to look different, because maybe one world is larger than the other, they can be very different. So the beliefs, the Bayesian beliefs are different. Now, this claim says, if you have two beliefs for different worlds over the same interface, there is always a way to coarse grain both to arrive to the same point. And that point is the epsilon transducer. So a way to think of this idea is that maybe me and Kioski, we have different metaphysics, so we disagree in a lot of things, but there are things that we can do experiments, and they have practical consequences. Those things we cannot disagree, because there will be a way to resolve that. And this world model, the world model of a transducer, is the minimal belief world that every agent with the same interface has to share, and is minimum. So my way of thinking is that agents with the same interface but different beliefs share the same core, that is this epsilon transducer. And also, the epsilon transducer contains all the predictive information about the world that is available through that interface. So in a way, the epsilon transducer contains every relevant thing and nothing else. And then that circumscribes the capabilities of the agent, because it's like the interface is this little thing that you're looking through to see the world. The epsilon transducer is going to represent everything that can be seen through that interface. And then it's very useful because it tells you what the agent can learn, when it cannot learn. If there's something that is not in the epsilon transducer, the agent cannot learn it because there is no access to that thing. Maybe it will believe in weird things, but it's nothing with the real world consequence for the world. Maybe for the agent because it goes crazy because it believes something weird. But the epsilon transducer then circumscribes what can be learned through that interface. So, to conclude, the first conclusion is that the class of world models that can simulate a given agent interface is very rich. When I started this project, I never expected to see all this diversity of weird things, including negative probabilities and whatnot. So there are a lot of world models that can be used to explain a given interface. That's the first conclusion. The second conclusion is that there is this fundamental trade-off between compression and interpretability. If we want to run a virtual world for a robot in the most efficient way, we're going to end up with a black box algorithm that will be very computationally efficient, maybe will run very fast, but we cannot reason about what the world is doing. And this is just a mathematical fact. If we now want to have a world that we can reason about and can tell us something, then it's not going to be the most efficient one. And there are different ways to do interpretability. We have more in the paper that I didn't discuss, but we have the idea of epsilon transducer that represent the minimal world model that contains everything that the agent could learn. And in the paper, we have also some retrodictive worlds that you can run back, and if you're interested, you can read about them. But there are different options for types of worlds that you can reason about. And with that, I'm close to being done. So let me, wait, a little bit more. So this is what I have done so far. And let me give you a glimpse of what I'm doing at the moment. So what we have done is that we have an interface and we don't touch the interface and we compress the world. So we keep fixed the interface and we compress the world. Now, a different question is, what if we fix the world and we try to compress the interface, right? And the idea is that you could use that by finding computational close interfaces. So for example, the agent is interacting with the world, but it is interacting at the quantum level, but maybe there's a classical level of the same interface that is going to be computationally self-contained. So that's sort of the idea. We have played about lossless things where we just get rid of redundancies. So we are simplifying the world, getting rid of redundancies, but we're keeping the interface the same. And the next step is to have a lossy version where we simplify the interface. We lose a little bit, but what we keep is self-contained. And a general idea would be, what is a useful criterion to have lossy compression of interfaces? And the idea here is that we are going to apply coarse grainings to inputs and outputs. We are going to simplify the observations of the agent. We're going to simplify the alphabet of actions. And we can apply the same notions of information closure, causal closure, computational closure to the interfaces, and we can get levels of description of the perception action loop that are going to be self-contained. And also this. And we can prove that the same type of relationship works. Oh, this is wrong. It should be from information closure implies computational closure, the same as before. And my claim, before finishing, is that I believe this is one way to characterize what abstractions are. Like, we are interacting with the world, and we choose to forget some details and keep some very high-level regularities that are self-contained, so they play with each other in a reliable way, and they ignore what is below. My claim is that that's the way we build abstractions, and that should be useful for generalization, right? We learn a task, we choose not to overfit in the sense of learning too many details, we learn a general structure, And then we go to another task that might look very different, but maybe if you coarse grain enough, it's actually the same task as before. And then you can do transfer learning if you learn how to do the right translation. So that's my current work, and that's why I believe this is a good approach to think about how we build abstractions. I don't think that is the whole mind, and there is a lot going on that is not going to be captured by this, but it's quite interesting to see how far this approach can go. And with that, I can conclude, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. And we have 7 minutes for questions, so if we want to start or against that. I just quick question to the last one, like a word model. Maybe I missed, but is there any constraint, like whatever, like you feel deterministic and predictable and stuff? Is that like what if like a quantum world, like something like probabilistically happening? Is it still you can apply the same?
Yeah. Usually they are stochastic.
Okay.
The only restriction is that this is a graphical model. So, for example, this means that if I condition on the state of the world, these two become independent of each other. And if I condition these two, these become independent, etc. No, here not because there is an arrow, but if you condition all of these become independent. Like
what if they're like so you don't assume anything in the actual world? What if it's just a pure random generator still?
No, that will not work.
So you need some structure.
Yes. So if you have this thing like this, and you assume that blue is whatever random thing, if you plug it in, you're not going to factorize into this.
Yeah.
For this, you need some information to be contained here so that you factor the things apart. Yeah, so there is a lot of constraints here. Basically, what you want, this is the conditional probability of the vector of observations, comma, the probability of the trajectory of the world, condition on the actions, you want it to be factorized in this specific way. So there is a lot of statistical independencies that has to be satisfied for it.
Okay, so my question is about the first part of your talk where you talk about the distinction between the agent and the environment. Can you go back to some random slide in the part? So, by the way, I'm a philosopher, so like my question is a bit philosophical. Oh yeah. So I think this is very cool. So the idea is that so you can predict the environment, like the sequences in the environment side on the basis of the history in the agent side. Like you can do the other way around. So this is your way of defining what agents are and then drawing the distinction between agents and environments. So that's cool. But my just naive question is, so that works like if that's is supposed to be a definition of what agents are and what environments are. So that works only if you can independently distinguish the agent history and the environment histories. So like because you need these things. So the question is how you separate the agent histories from environment histories without, because the distinction, the boundary between them is exactly what you want to define. So, but then how can you differentiate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would not say this is a good definition of an agent. I think this is a very poor definition of an agent because you're not defining what is goals, what is planning. There's nothing like that. And as you say correctly, this is also not a definition of what is a boundary. The only thing that you're getting out of this is for a given boundary, how can you get the things that are crossing the boundaries?
I see.
What is crossing from the environment to the agent and what is crossing from the agent to the environment? This is the only thing you're getting. So it's a very small piece of the big puzzle. I sort of find it interesting. I don't know how serious to take this, to be honest, but I find it a very interesting idea, but it's a very small part of a bigger puzzle. So as you say, this is not a way to, there is a bit of a suggestion that whatever the boundary you make that minimize this could be a good cut. So that's sort of an idea, but I would not say that is sufficient to say what is in one side. For example, this assumes some symmetry between environment and agent, and that's weird. I think that agents are different from environments, although some people disagree, but I tend to think they're different, and that this doesn't give you that. This also doesn't give you anything about is the agent doing some inference about the environment, or is it, like it's not giving any of that. So all of those things, I think, could be future developments that could be combined with this theory, perhaps. But so far, this theory is very basic, and it's just pointing some basic ideas on how boundaries are went over.
Yeah.
So
I mean, totally agree. This is super cool. So, yeah.
I found this also really interesting because to me, like IIT have like like strange excursion criteria. They don't really say like a boundary, and it's so natural to me. Like yeah, of course, if you see the system as integrated, of course there should be some boundary, and this is very clearly say that kind of.
Also, part of my motivation was that at this point it was like free energy here, IIT here, completely not talking to each other, and it was like all boundaries and messages and the other integration. How are they related? And this equation, I find it nice that it's putting everything in the same picture. I think there's much more than this, but this is a good starting point for that connection.
Let's make sure. So from this formula, agent and the environment is kind of exchangeable. So we cannot discriminate. It's completely symmetric, right?
Yes.
So there's something
missing. Yes.
Thank you very much.
My one idea I have that I haven't developed is that I think there could be a way to measure time irreversibility. Like, for example, if you take this picture and you flip it, time, I have a belief, kind of an intuition that maybe the environment is going to be more reversible, so more similar, and the agent is going to be less similar. Because the agent is sort of planning for the future, the agent is not planning for the future. So maybe that's a way to get a difference between environment and agent.
Relevant to Lyota's recent idea. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think there are ways to explore that, putting more ideas here. So these ideas are not enough. We need more ideas on top.
Thank you.
There's one question from online. You can maybe read, but I can read it.
Can you read?
So from Jun Takahashi, I think the last part about negative probability. He was a bit confused why having a unique minimum model was so important. There are so many cost functions that can have multiple minima.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think this is one of those, or is this more like some philosophical reason to believe there should be only one unique?
At this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. I would say at this point, my interest was not so much philosophical, it was more computational. Like I wanted to have the model that was most efficient to run. And then if this is everything you have, if you start your observation from here, you end up here, and you start from here, you end up here, and maybe this is more efficient than this. And how do you know? Like you would need to check every possible model, simulate it down, and like do everything until you are sure that this is actually the minimal one. So just from a computational side, it's good to have the other result because you go and actually there are ways to compute this negative thing directly. So computationally, it's good to have a minimal one because it's like this is the optimal thing you can do, and you just do it.
I don't really get these pictures. It can't say something like.
It's a bit surrealistic. No? I just find it funny.